during the past century, we have increased our lifespan by 30 years. Most of that increase is due to vaccines. Before vaccines, pertussis, or whooping cough, routinely killed 8,000 people a year, mostly children. Rubella, or German measles, would cause birth defects in as many as 20,000 children every year. Measles would commonly cause between 500 and 1,000 to die every year. Diphtheria was the most common killer of teenagers, all this before vaccines. But I think you could argue that no vaccine captured, I think, the emotions, certainly of the American public, as much as the polio vaccine did. I mean, you looked at these children walking down the street and as if they had gone to war. I mean, it was as if they were veterans of a foreign war, and it was young children. I think it was just a very, very emotional disease for this country.
Dr. Salk, before I hand you this citation, I have no words in which adequately to express the thanks of myself, all the people I know, and all 164 million Americans, to say nothing of all the other people in the world that will profit from your discovery. I am very, very happy to hand that to you.
When we look back upon polio today, you look back upon what was really a summer plague. It came every year. It came like locusts. And newspapers would have almost baseball box scores of the numbers of kids who would come down with it in that week. It would start around late May and go up in June and higher in July and spike in August. And then by Labor Day, the summer plague would be over. It would hit this kid and not this kid, and nobody knew why. It would descend on Denver, but not on San Francisco, and no one knew why. All you knew was that every summer, thousands of very unlucky kids would come down with this insidious disease that usually left them incapacitated and often killed them.
People had all kinds of theories about it. You shouldn't take your kids to a public pool. Nobody should give birthday parties. I mean, it was like a phantom enemy, this illness, and I was scared to death as a young mother.
Polio would spread silently and then pick out its victim and continue to spread silently, pick out another victim.
It was known by then that it was a virus disease, but there was no way to treat it. And there wasn't really sure how it was transmitted. People weren't sure.
One of the great ironies of polio is that it appears to be a disease of cleanliness. It begins in the United States in epidemic form early in the 20th century, at the very time we are becoming increasingly antiseptic, germ-phobic. Advertising is telling us that germs are very, very deadly, that we don't see them, but they are killers. And the more cleanliness becomes kind of a way of life in the United States, the less likely young kids are to have immune systems that fight off disease easily.
There was a tremendous amount of myth and misinformation that surrounded the disease. People thought that the disease was spread by cats. They thought it was spread by fleas. They thought that it was spread by organ grinders, monkeys. They thought that it was spread by bananas that had been imported from South America. They thought that it could be cured by ox blood or sassafras or wood shavings. There were just all kinds of myths.
Every day when I went out to play, my grandmother would take a cloth bag with a piece of solid camphor, which is they used to use it for mothballs. And she would put this little bag on a string and put it around my neck and send me out to play. And she was sure till the day she died that she had kept me from getting polio.
My mother at that time would actually not let me play with new kids, the logic being that I had the germs of my older friends, and there was no reason for me to get near new kids because they may spread the polio germ. And it was really that kind of fear that was felt by every parent in this country. There was no prevention. There was no cure. There was no protection. You could be a good parent, a bad parent, an indifferent parent, and you still had no way of protecting your child against polio.
Polio is transmitted from person to person. A child with polio infection comes in contact with another child and transmits that infection. The virus reproduces in the mouth, it reproduces in the intestine, gets into the blood, and invades the nervous system. And what it does is it kills a particular cell in the nervous system called the anterior horn cell. And this cell tells the muscles what to do. It's like cutting the wires to a light bulb. The light goes off.
Well, I had a bad headache and went to the doctor the next day, and the following day I collapsed. And they figured I had polio and shipped me off to Municipal Hospital.
I caught polio when I was 21 months old, back in 1952. Our house was immediately quarantined. A lot of people from the health department came to the house to interview my parents to find out where we've been, what we did, try to find out where we may have contracted the disease and everything. And meanwhile, we were all sent to Municipal Hospital. Started showing signs of paralysis. And at that time, you got in an iron lung. That was what happened when you went there and you had breathing problems. And I was in an iron lung for approximately 11 days.
If they couldn't swallow and get all these secretions in their throat and down into their lungs, and then they couldn't breathe, that was a deadly combination. And so they put them in an iron lung, which would give positive and negative pressure to expand the chest so that they could breathe. That would like pull air into the chest and push air out of the chest. It was a nightmare. It was a total nightmare, both for the patients and for the doctors.
We would get these children coming up and they would be screaming, and the anxiety level was unbelievable. You try to comfort them, and how do you comfort a 4 or 5-year-old? He didn't even have his teddy bear. He could take nothing with him.
And I remember the faces on some of these kids, you know, in agony. Just picture your own 2-year-old, you know, can't breathe, and it's just dreadful.
Danny was probably my most favorite patient. He was a little 5-year-old, and he had bulbar polio, so he was in a respirator. I would tell Danny little jokes and read him stories and everything, and it was a beautiful relationship. So I came on duty, and I pick up my clipboard, and I look down, and I don't see Danny's name. And I said to someone, I said, why don't I have Danny today? It was the loudest silence I ever heard in my life. So I dropped my clipboard and I ran down to his respirator, and it was empty.
Polio, no treatment. You just try to keep them alive with artificial breathing and physical therapy, and then try to equip them with some kind of gear that would help them walk again if you've managed to save their lives.
really, when you talk about polio or infantile paralysis, you must in the United States begin with FDR, with President Roosevelt. He got it at the age of 39 in 1921 and spent the rest of his life really trying to find the cure and the prevention. He never found the cure. He died in 1945 still having polio. But what Roosevelt did was to put together a voluntary organization that was absolutely extraordinary. In the past, philanthropies are a few millionaires giving money and throwing it at some project. What the March of Dimes did was to turn this on its head.
1, 2, 3, 4. Each year, his birthday was celebrated with mammoth parties in behalf of the March of Dimes.
Back when it started, it was called the Mother's March. And its goal was to collect money to do research to conquer children's diseases, and polio was its primary target. Their name was then changed to the March of Dimes because a dime was the currency at the time that was a meaningful contribution from a child.
Fight polio tonight. Let the marching mothers know you're waiting for them.
I remember going out with my mother on the Mother's March, and you would go around the neighborhood, and if the light were on the front porch, then I would go to the house and collect a little cardboard thing that had inserts for coins to go in, and we would gather those and ship those literally to the White House.
There are a lot of parents whose children are healthy and happy now, who live in fear. I know I do. The fear, my friends, is polio.
What made the March of Dimes such an extraordinary organization was that, for one thing, they used the latest techniques in advertising and public relations. They got celebrities like Mickey Rooney and Marilyn Monroe and Elvis Presley, and I mean, I have a picture in my book of a very uncomfortable Richard Nixon pumping gas for polio.
They interrupt the serials in the motion picture house. We will now have a collection of March of Dimes, and other kids, they want to see the movie.
Upon the quarters and dimes and dollars that you give now in this theater depends the happiness of some child somewhere tomorrow.
They also used poster children. You know, give me your money and help me walk. And it was dime by dime by dime. Everyone would give whatever he or she could. It would be a crusade involving tens of thousands of people, and you would really make it into a national crusade. These were Americans pulling together, and they were pulling together to some degree because this was a children's disease. And having a visual disease where you saw leg braces and you saw crutches and you saw iron lungs was something that was simply intolerable to the American conscience. And they united as a people to do away with it.
I like it.
I grew up in a family where there was a sense, you know, that my dad was a scientist and that he did science. And he actually would talk about how he used to really, as a child, pray that he could do something good for humanity. He chose research, and he said this throughout his life. I chose to do research because I asked myself, what can I do that's going to do the greatest good for the greatest number of people?
Jonas Salk is brought to the University of Pittsburgh from Michigan, not to work on polio, but to work on influenza. And what Salk understands very early on is that, you know, you sort of go where the money is. And the money was coming from the National Foundation with very, very large grants for polio.
My father had an opportunity to participate in the complete drudgery of the poliovirus typing program. Now that's something that no budding scientist at the beginning of his or her career would want to take on, but this was an entree.
Here was a place he could get started. I mean, the good news was that there was a philanthropical base that was going to support him here. The bad news was it was Pittsburgh, which at the time was in the backwater of science. Jonas Salk was enormously well organized. He was very hardworking, and he basically could run a laboratory much as one would run a laboratory in industry. He had a lot of people that worked for him, and he was very good at being able to do difficult and arguably boring tasks quickly and well. And so one of his original tasks was to try and determine how many different types of polioviruses there were, because if there were many types, then all of them would need to be included in a vaccine.
In order to do anything towards a vaccine, one had to make sure that there were only 3 types of polio. They knew that there were 3 types, but what if there were more?
It was essential. I mean, prior vaccines may have failed because they didn't have a representative of the 3 types. So it requires an intense effort to collect meaningful information. Then you can analyze it and then get meaningful results.
Dr. Salk and his research team were in the basement. They were looking for the live polio virus. And so when a patient has to have a bowel movement, we would cover the bedpan with a sterile towel and run to the door. And sitting out in the hall on wooden benches would be Pitt medical students. Kind of cute, too. And that was their primary job, was to grab that bedpan and have it down in the lab, probably within a minute or 2. And that's where Dr. Salk isolated the live polio virus from a young male patient at Municipal Hospital.
This was the job that prominent researchers, prominent virologists would not do. This was the job that an Albert Sabin would give to a graduate student. It was scut work, it was hard work, it was uninteresting work, but what Jonas Salk intuitively understood was that it was the kind of work that would get him on the March of Dimes bandwagon. He was the miracle worker in the white coat on the one hand, but he was also an incredibly hard-working, devoted scientist for whom people were willing to sacrifice. And Jonas Salk, at the University of Pittsburgh, put together an extraordinary team of researchers. And what Salk did was sort of direct this team and whip this team and move it in a single direction. And that direction was to put out a killed virus polio vaccine as quickly as possible.
He very much inspired a level of loyalty and devotion in people. People had a sense that they were doing something of value, that there was a higher purpose to what they were doing. And that was a tremendously powerful thing. But when he was tracking down something, when something needed to be done, it had to be done. And he really did not tolerate delays very well.
He had recruited 2 professionals who were here. Byron Bennett and Jim Lewis were already here. Jim Lewis was doing most of the monkey work, and Byron Bennett was in charge of the mouse work and the preparation of all the samples that came from the monkeys.
We had our own animal colonies on the 2nd floor. We had rhesus monkeys and then later on cynomolgus monkeys. And by the way, we made all of our own food for the monkeys. That food was made in our basement, in vitamins and supplements that we purchased.
When we were on the night shifts, we knew exactly when we had 1 hour to go. The monkeys would wake up at 6 a.m. and they would grab their food pans and they would clang them against the bars of their cages. What a racket. And we would look at each other and smile and say, we have 1 hour to go. You know, so we called it monkey time.
In the early months of 1955, final tabulation of the Salk field trial results is being completed at the University of Michigan.
The big announcement was going to be made on April 12th, so the pitch was going up in terms of press coverage of this as a seminal event in medical history.
It takes a full year for the results to be analyzed. Everybody's nervous. Jonas Salk is confident, but doesn't know. No one tells him.
This is Tuesday, April